if we look at other states, for example, Britain, we think about the Norman invasion of 1076. But if you actually look around there, it's almost like most states are born in violence. And if they are, can we then expect them not to be equally violent towards neighbors and others? So we have looked at Hobbes' argument on the Leviathan and the question of human nature. Now, there's different perspectives on formation of states, and so these are probably better previewed in international relations, which looks at three sort of levels of formation of states. So we think about individual behavior, we think about the behavior of the society as a whole, but we also think about the behavior of other states influencing the behavior of the state. So it's the states do not form in a vacuum. But so when we think about Hobbes, he looks at human beings as naturally selfish, wicked, and untrustworthy. Now, I don't know if this is a very positive way of thinking about humans, although it's a realistic way of thinking about us, but we also there's also other elements in our lives, which, for example, will lead a mother to, put up, don't know if there's a crisis, to put on a swimming vest or lifesaver on their child before themselves. So we are not necessarily all selfish and wicked and untrustworthy all the time. We are, I think, to some extent, but also, and this is what Rousseau points out, that we help people not because it's going to benefit us. Now, maybe there's some benefit to us because then we feel good about helping people, but immediately it's not clear that helping others helps us other than feeling better. And so, again, when you sort of think about Hobbes' perspective of this, we are selfish, we are wicked, we are horrible people, we need some authority to keep us in line and from destroying each other. And this is what he proposed with the Leviathan. So he also did sort of suggest that, or his thinking was more driven by secularism rather than religion. And again, this is the Middle Ages, so everything was infused with religion. But he also shows that we are controlled by authorities everywhere we go. So whether it's, for example, by God, after humans were kicked out of. So I know I said he doesn't refer to religion, but he talks about the Garden of Eden. Now, I think the Garden of Eden is specifically a religious reference rather than a secular reference. But so he talks about having different authorities to keep us in check, whether it's God, priests, or kings. And so for Hobbes, civilization is these ideas of order, restraint, learning, and so on. But again, as we mentioned, Hobbes writes in the aftermath of the English Civil War, so his writings are from a certain perspective. Now, so we think about the state and the qualities of the state. One of the major qualities of the state is sovereignty, even though there is maybe mixed use of sovereignty by the philosophers of this period. So the sovereign is often seen as the ruler or the king, and so if you sort of go back and combine all of these thoughts, Machiavelli talks about the prince who is also the sovereign. Bourdain talks about absolute sovereignty, which is sort of like the king, which is conflated by God with God. But for Hobbes, sovereignty is sort of like ability to do what to rule without outside interference. This is kind of what we think of sovereignty today. And so again, think about the influences of the time. So for example, the Huguenot monarchomacs were people who valued, or people who opposed tyranny. And so they actually endorsed tyrannicide, which is killing tyrants. Now, if you look at the Virginia flag, most interesting. Yeah, it's. Anyone ever looked at the Virginia flag? No. So it has. Let's see if I can find. Yeah. So semper tyrannis. The idea that. Yeah, on this it's probably visible, or maybe it's not. But the man stepping on, yeah. So, death to the tyrant, I think, is the popular way of thinking about semper tyrannis. So, even as we see the development of ideas about who rules, we still see these kinds of ideas like, okay, maybe we should not allow tyrants to rule. And it is the case that a lot of European monarchs were kind of tyrants, as described by, among others, the colonists. So, but we also need to think about the formation of these states. How do they see themselves? How do societies perceive themselves? And so some of this perception is seen in how nations call themselves. And so I think it was Reagan who, maybe he was quoting someone, who were talking about the shining city on a hill. The irony of the use of this phrase was, and maybe he wasn't talking about other places, but the US supported the South African government during apartheid, which clearly was a tyrannical government. And so, are you a shining city on a hill? But also, the shining city on a hill comes from a very specific reference, Callipolis, by, I think it's Aristotle, Plato's. So, countries, societies will see themselves as certain ways. Now, Russia is often described or identified as Mother Russia. So I don't know if anyone says Mother United States. No, but it's just the United States. So you think about Mother Russia, you think about mother nurturing, those kinds of things, and it kind of makes sense. But it's also denoted by the image of a bear. Now, bears are apex predators. So it's sort of like, this is how well, maybe they don't see themselves as apex predators or predators, but sort of that strong image of don't mess with us. There are very few countries that call themselves, well, actually, there's probably just one country that calls itself father. So countries are often identified as feminine. So Mother Russia. People will say the motherland. I don't know. But Germany, for example, is the fatherland. It's probably the only country that is a father. And again, is it the question of who presides over society, family? Anyway, so countries will see themselves certain ways. Greece is the origin of democracy, even though that was also very sketchy, given that slaves did not have freedoms. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia sees itself as the custodian of the two holy mosques, of course in Mecca and Medina. And so again, countries will see themselves a certain way, and seek to. So there's a bit of myths of development of states and what they become. Now the Greeks, of course, have very interesting other stories about how they came to be. Probably we shall not talk about them, but again, we talked about Greece contributions to modernity, so chaos, Erebus. And we actually name places after these things. So, for example, there's a Mount Erebus in the Arctic. Yeah, chaos, ether. In our common, so for example, in movies, you will see a lot of this. I'm thinking of the Avengers, maybe. Erebus, night, give birth to ether. Ether is heavenly light and day. So again, you sort of see how people see themselves. But again, we have integrated this into our societies. I don't, think that there's anyone who hasn't heard of the Titans. But so when we think about how states are formed, we also look at who has talked about the formation of states, and I'm sure there's more than this. But we want to focus on some of these, like we have talked about Aristotle, Plato and Socrates. We talked about Machiavelli, Hobbes. We haven't really talked much about John Locke. We shall do that. We talked about Rousseau briefly. And again, you have to remember that these are dialogues often between these individuals. And so when you sort of think about when the state actually becomes a state, it's sort of like in 1648, even though before that we have societies comporting themselves. So, for example, Athens, Greece, those were city-states. But the difference is that today a state has to have international recognition. So if you're not recognized, and there's a process for international recognition. Later on this September, I would encourage you to pay attention to the United Nations. Palestine has applied to become a state. Now, the way that a country becomes a state is it applies to the United Nations. The UN Security Council deliberates on whether that territory can become a state, and then they vote on it. Now, the problem that states run into, or aspiring future states, is that if any of the five permanent members, the US, UK, France, China, Russia, if any of them vote no, that is what we call a veto, and so that whole situation is dead. Everybody knows that the US will not allow Palestine to become a state. Why? Because it has allies, or Israel is its ally. And so the process of recognition becomes a very big challenge. The last state to become a state was actually South Sudan, maybe in 2011. They went through about 40 years of war and peace treaties and a referendum on whether they were going to stay as the Sudan. But so when we sort of think about the process of formation of states and recognition today, it's a little different. But so when we sort of think about the road to statehood and sort of actually think what the state is, beneficial institution created by rational people to protect their natural rights and interests. But it also has to have certain features, for example, legitimacy, population, economic activity, those kinds of things. Now, later on, so you see some sort of peripheral reference to other things that the state should do. So, for example, why do people form states? So the idea of protecting their natural rights, protecting them from who? Now, in this country, I think people are more terrified of the state, the government taking people's rights, even though it does that a little, sometimes a lot. But also think about, like, if there was no authority, and this is where Locke really, Wolf really focuses his arguments. If there was no central authority, what is to prevent us from taking anything that we want? And so when we are protecting our rights and interests, it's not just from the state, it's also from other people so that we can thrive. So issues of legitimacy, moral, and legal right to rule, basis being the customs, heredity, consent, and so on. Like, what are the processes of the rulers? So we have states, we have rulers. How do we get them to be rulers? And so these are really the major questions that these philosophers are struggling with. We talked about the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648. Europe was lots of carnage, deaths, and so on. But so particularly 1648, despite the questions over whether 1648 was that important, heralds the modern day idea of sovereignty. And so the idea that you can decide what happens within your country. We have talked a lot about, maybe some about sovereignty, and seeing that, for example, China, which is one of the US's biggest trading partners, is also a leading country in terms of human rights abuses and execution of prisoners. So, but really, what can anyone do? Saudi Arabia is also up there, executes people, chops off their hands. But so this idea of states are formed, and then they assert sovereignty, so rights within their own territory, right of non-interference in domestic politics. However, we should say that this right is not absolute, and just because it's on paper, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. I think we know that countries interfere in the affairs of other countries all the time, including trying to bias the election, including costing one certain presidential candidate the election, even though that might have been a different but so again, it's useful to, even though the windshield is the bigger one, sometimes you want to look in the rearview mirror and see, city-states that give rise to the modern states. But we also see other civilizations. So, for example, Arab civilizations, Byzantine Empire, European empires. So they had rulers, they had councils that governed them, but they were not necessarily in the current context of the state. So when we think about sovereignty and what it means, we look to certain people and what their definitions were. So even though we disagree with Jean Bodin in some instances, so Bodin, Filmar, are associated with the school of thought of the divine right of kings, the royal prerogative, the mandate of heaven, the idea that God chooses kings. Even though the world disagrees with that, at least Locke disagrees with that, we can still look to some of their definitions and ask ourselves, what did they think of this idea? So sovereignty, what is sovereignty? Ability to determine what happens within your territory. Now, because he is a pro-monarchist, he talks about absolute and perpetual power vested in a commonwealth. And the commonwealth is headed by, of course, the monarch. So now you see here where he conflates sovereign and sovereignty. So talks about the sovereign, so the person who rules over the commonwealth cannot be in any way the subject of the commands of another. So in theory, if you're the president or the leader, you can't be taking orders from someplace else. This has been an issue, especially in the US, with Catholic presidents who are thought to maybe possibly be influenced by the Vatican. I don't know if that is necessarily the case. Now, so the sovereign, in theory, or at least in Bodin's theory, means that they cannot take, they cannot be the subject of the commands of another, because he makes the laws for the subject, abrogates law, or amends obsolete law. Now, here we run into a bit of an issue, because this is sort of absolutist. If he is the one who makes law, and again, there's very interesting arguments going on in the US, like the sovereign is not subject to the commands of another, but are they subject to the commands of their people? One individual has argued no, they have absolute immunity, so they can literally. Now, if you extend that, if I had absolute immunity, could I not murder people? I mean, what's going to stop me? I'm not subject to the laws. Well, I agree. But you need to have a moral compass for it to actually kick in. Now, if you don't, I mean, if someone insults you, you're like, oh yeah, I'm about to take them out. So even from a layman's perspective, I don't think that, but so that particular individual would make this argument that, the sovereign cannot be the subject to the commands of another, including the laws. But if you are taking an oath of office to faithfully execute the laws, isn't this sort of like backwards? You're violating the laws that you are, although in someone's defense, that would be cool, because then we can violate the law. I mean, we take the example of the, no. So it is possible that he's taking us back into the state of nature. Like this is not, and Locke will have trouble with this idea that the sovereign cannot be the subject to the commands of another. He makes the law, abrogates the law, and amends obsolete law. Abrogates the law is suspending law. And I think you may know or have heard, I don't know if you follow or if you're going to maybe law school. There's a case, I think US or Bush v. Hamden, it might have been. So remember those people we sent to Guantanamo Bay? And we were like, they are not on US soil, so they have no rights. The Supreme Court kind of didn't agree with that. Like, habeas corpus requires you to be brought before a court of law to challenge your lawful or unlawful detention. So if you can make law as you go, like that whole enemy combatant designation was intended to circumvent the Geneva Conventions. Because if you call someone enemy combatant rather than prisoner of war, then they are not covered by the Geneva Conventions. Sort of like that whole concept of being voluntold. You don't have to do it, but it's so this becomes a little problematic. And so Locke's argument is that actually the sovereign is subject to the commands, to the will of the people. Like he can't just say, I'm ruling in God's favor, because how do we even know? But so when we think about the state, and some of these are more contemporary conceptualizations of what the state is and who rules the state, we sort of think about form and appearance. form and appearance. So there's what is seen as the sovereign power state. So the European systems, like this is your country, you can do everything that you want within your territory. There's the commercial state, which is, think about business, think about trade, think about, so, and the way I would probably think about this is, think about moving capital, like money, or getting goods from a different country. So this is a different type of, you have to conform to the laws, but that is not maybe. So the way I often think about this is Facebook. And some of us are old enough to be on Facebook, some of us don't care for Facebook. But think about Facebook and the power that Mark Zuckerberg has. It's like a country. If he wants to communicate to like 2 billion people, he can. He can tell them stuff, he can ask them to do stuff, he can. So this surpasses the state authority. It's a different kind of authority. But also, if you think about the Catholic Church, for example, and all its adherents, it's possible to communicate with them. And so this is sort of like but in this case, we're talking about the capitalist mode of production, which is, I mean, even China embraced capitalism. So there's another state above the borders and people and those kinds of things. Now, there's a liberal constitutional state, which talks about individual rights and liberties. And so here, most Western nations are legal constitutional states because they have constitutions. They focus on individual rights and liberties, even though these are often taken away. So for certain groups, think about police shootings, for example. Think about dispossession of Native Americans. So there's a legal and constitutional framework, but it still does some shady stuff. And then there's a democratic nation state, which is the model of Western nations. There are other nations that call themselves democratic, and there are serious questions about their levels of democracy. But also, it's important to think about democracy. What is democracy? How do we define it? Is it a thing that we can all identify with? So that is Otto Hintze's conceptualization of the state. So there are many people who have talked about what the state is. My favorite is Weber. Now, Stephen Krasner, who is an international relations person, talks about what the state has. Government. It's rare to have a state that doesn't have a government. Actually, is it rare though? Haiti. Now, so maybe Haiti is a good example of what the state of nature looks like. Currently. Yeah. Now, so we shall not assign blame. We shall only ask ourselves. So, for example, this is a phone, right? Now, I might use it to do human trafficking. I do not. But even if I did, it would still be a phone, right? I mean, how I apply it doesn't change. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Haiti is the example of the state of nature, because I think there's some law and order, even if it's given by the gang leaders. So I don't know that is necessarily. But also, whose fault is it?
A lot of people have played a hand with other countries.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even its first formation was, um, if slavery didn't exist, but there was, and I don't know, you all know who founded Regent University, CBN, maybe? Pat Robertson passed away maybe last year or the previous year. So he said Haiti's problems come from about 200 and some years ago when they murdered all those French people. So apparently it's God's punishment for, for them. That's what he said. Now, I think he ignored the whole colonialism, I mean, not slavery thing. So I don't. Now, there are many other countries that are not thriving. Like the government doesn't, and so maybe we should jump ahead and say this is why Weber says one of the identifying features of a government is monopoly over violence. So Haiti has all these other things, like it has people who normally live there. There's some economic activity. There are social systems. It's recognized internationally. Now the government is it has institutions. Even though, for example, the idea is to have another election so they actually have a government in power. But so it's lacking one of those things, but also maybe lacking the monopoly over violence. So where does Haiti get guns? It's an island. I would point to a country to the northwest of Haiti, but I am not pointing fingers. So yeah, there's a lot of mess in that Haiti situation. But so when we think about, without necessarily pointing to specific countries, we want to ask ourselves, how do I know a state when I see one? And so those are the things that it. Now, Weber says the most important thing is monopoly over violence, that you control private violence between people, otherwise, you have chaos and people will be murdering each other. But we also maybe want to ask ourselves, where does the state derive its, like how is it formed? We are talking about the characteristics of a state government, law, people, economy, recognition, but how does it get there? And so to this, we look to Rousseau and the social contract. I still really strongly recommend that, and I think his book is now available as a PDF online for free. But so this is what he thinks. That all these other societies, whether they are states, they are manufactured. That the only natural ancient society is the family. I agree with him to some extent, but I don't know that people choose. I mean, like if you're kids, do you choose to be in a family or do you find yourself there? And so is that necessarily natural? Good question. And so he really does talk about the family being the natural, the origin of society. The children remain attached to the father. Doesn't even talk about the mother, but he was misogynist. But so he talks about them being attached to the father so long as they need him for their preservation. And this is probably true. I mean, until kids are like 16, 17, they kind of need their parents. As soon as this need ceases, this natural bond is dissolved. And that the only thing that now ties the family is you choose to remain tied to the family. Some people choose not to. So soon as this need ceases, soon as they can provide for themselves, then they are released from the obedience of the father, and from then on they are only in this society because they want to. And so he parallels this with the formation of society. So think about organizations you've been part of or you started. You agreed on the rules and the conduct and the things that you'll do and things you will not do, the things that will get you kicked out, the things that could get you admitted into that society. So the children will return to independence, but if they do remain united, they only do so because they want to. Not they continue voluntarily, not naturally. The family is maintained by convention, and so I don't know if there are conventions in families you come from, like Sunday nights dinner, Sundays church, and annual gatherings of maybe family. So these are sort of the convention. Now you can choose to go or maybe choose not to go. But so this is what he says. Now, so he uses the family to demonstrate how people come together and agree to be bound by rules. But he also makes a very interesting point, which I think any thriving state would want to take up, that you should involve the people in the development of the rules under which they will live, because otherwise you're coercing them. And I've made the point that most Americans don't. So the theory is that you consent to being an American because you vote, you follow the laws, but does anyone really ask you if you want to be, if you consent to being an American, to being governed, to being, like, is there some contract between people and the state? But should you not have like some like if you take up citizenship in another country, you choose citizenship and you probably take an oath. You agree to be bound by the rules. In fact, if you look at the citizenship oath of citizenship, individuals will actually actively denounce allegiance to other princes, principalities, laws. So that is a choice that someone is making. But if you're born here, I don't think you take that oath. You do take like if you are an officer of the military, you take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. But for regular citizens, what? But I can pledge allegiance even if I'm not a citizen. Because I'm pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States. I could pledge allegiance to the maple leaf.
But people in other countries, that's just how it is. Well, if you're born there, then unless, like you said, they grow up or move to the United States, that would be the same, like if you want to try to get.
Yes, but the point is, you do not. There's no this what we call implicit consent, which is what most Americans do. You follow the laws, you get a driver's license, sometimes like the things that you do imply that you consent to being American and to living here. But is that necessarily the case? What if there are times when you do not consent? Because now there are some people who do not consent and they just up and leave.
But you gotta read that's the same concept of saying you can't pick your parents. You can't pick where you're born, the same thing, you can't pick who you're born to.
Yeah, but I don't think you can change your parents. You can change.
Yeah, Yeah, but I'm saying like as a pick, you know what I mean? Because if you're born here, you know, you have to be up to a certain age before you can even change your mind or do certain things legally. So if you're a child and you have to develop, you just gotta be, you know what I mean, aware of
Yes.
saying.
But so let's go back to Rousseau, who says, as soon as the children have no dependence on the father, they maintain those associations voluntarily.
Right.
When you are born and you have the chance to change where you
You gotta wait till you get older and start to like watching it.
that is true. So
You
when
gotta wait your time.
at 18 you can change, and so it seems to me like there ought to be some way of obtaining consent, because if I don't vote, and voting is my implied consent, does that mean I haven't given consent?
But if you don't give some type of consent, which, same type of example, consent being like following the rules and whatever, then you don't get to be considered a part. It's like they won't let people maintain or get into this relationship who have felonies or certain felonies. You know what I'm saying? So if you don't follow the rules, then you can't become part of the team.
Yeah, but I'm going to maybe, like, if you go to Saudi Arabia today and you walk around without your hair covered, you will be in trouble. So following rules is not consent. Like everywhere there are rules. I don't think there's any society without rules.
But I think that is though, because if you don't follow the rules, then you're rebelling.
Mm.
So you're saying that, okay, so if you're a rule breaker, that means you're not following the rules, if you're rebelling against what society is telling you to do.
That is true, but I think if you go to any society, you have to follow rules. Whether if I go to Switzerland, and some of it is because it's good for me. Like you don't want to go to Kenya and drive on the right side of the road. That will be very detrimental to you because everyone else is on the other side. So so rules are sometimes are good for, I mean, there's no society where you can go and they say, well, you don't have to follow the rules. And so the question then is, does following rules necessarily imply we accept jurisdiction of that place? Because then it might not be reciprocal. If you go to, so you probably know this, you shouldn't know this, but the age at which you can purchase and consume alcohol, like in England, is 16. Now, should we move to England so we can drink at 16? Like, so if you drink at 16, you're good. If you come back in, you're like, well, I was drinking at 16 in England, so I should. So rules.
I feel like that is different. Yeah. I don't think that's the same.
So it's not about rules. Rules are meant for the good order of society, and you're going into that society. They already have rules. They're not.
So you're gonna follow the rules, like they say
Anyway,
in Rome.
you're going to follow them anyway. But does that make you?
It makes you acceptable of whatever rules of the city, state, country, whatever you